My hands were still shaking when I unfolded the paper. The stamp said paid in full in red, the numbers handwritten in blue ink that I recognized at once. $52,000. The paper was thin, the creases worn where I'd folded it in the car, and it smelled faintly of coffee, the same bitter roast they serve in the fellowship hall after services. I pressed the receipt against my palm as if it could warm me. We had sat in the third pew for 40 years. I could still find the exact spot by feel, scar in the wood from where my knee tapped the hymn book, faint indentation in the cushion from the winters my husband and I shared our coat. On Sunday, the whole sanctuary rose to its feet. The choir's voices swelled, the organ filled the rafters, and under the lights Pastor Gordon introduced Timothy as the future of our church. He spoke of calling, of sacrifice, of community. And we thank our faithful supporters, he said, looking out at the congregation with that practiced warmth. He gestured toward the Sanders family in the front row. Mr. Sanders smiled and gave a small wave. Hands clapped. The applause rolled over me like cold water. Each clap landed on that receipt in my bag. I folded the paper and tucked it into the inner pocket. You learn to hide things at my age. Tears, pills, grief. Only Esther saw my fingers tremble. She was to my left, her hat slightly askew, her hand finding mine without words. Her grip said the same thing she always says. I'm here. It had begun in a study group on a rainy Wednesday. The window panes were beaded with water, and the room smelled of damp coats and lemon-scented sanitizer. Pastor Gordon mentioned Timothy then, offhand, like a good deal announced from behind a pulpit. He's been accepted to seminary, he said, and his eyes slid toward me. But he needs help. My throat tightened. Richard had been gone 3 months. The house was too quiet, coffee cups left cold, his slippers by the bed. When the pastor put his hand on my shoulder in the corridor after the meeting, the church's coffee smell clung to him like an invisible shawl. Betty, he said, you always had a generous heart. Richard would have loved this. There's a place in a widow's chest where longing and loyalty sit together. I remembered Richard's soft laugh when I told him once, decades earlier, that I'd rather give than keep. The memory made me both ache and decide. I wrote the check the next morning at my kitchen table. The paper felt heavy under my fingers. The ink smelled like the night we balanced our accounts, arguing over shingles and savings, plotting small pleasures for retirement. I told Timothy, when he came to my house, that it must be between him, me, and God. He pressed his hands around his cup like a shield and promised to honor it. After that, he was everywhere. At the door greeter station, adjusting a hymn sheet, smiling that open, earnest smile whenever our eyes met. Pastor Gordon called me often with updates, tuition, books, registration, and each call ended the same way. Your reward will be in heaven. His voice was soft but certain. I gave because I believed. The Sunday of the send-off, the sanctuary smelled like lilies and beeswax polish. Blue and gold banners hung from the balcony. I wore my navy dress and the pearl brooch Richard had given me for our 40th anniversary, its little pin warmed by my heart when I walked down the aisle. The choir sang a new arrangement. Their voices trembled in the high notes like leaves. When the pastor announced the Sanders, I felt the room tilt. He praised the family's public spirit, the gift that would change Timothy's path. Timothy took the microphone and thanked the Sanders for believing in me. He didn't look at me. He didn't have to. Gratitude is a complicated thing, and I had asked for silence. The receipt burned behind my ribs. Half our nest egg gone. Money I had pictured using to fix the sagging roof, to cross the country to see Jennifer in California more than once every few months, to pay for a small trip where I could stand by the ocean and say goodbye properly. I folded my hands to keep from trembling. My breath came shallow, a little sharp at the collarbone. Esther leaned in, her eyes questioning. I gave her a small, automatic smile. It was made of habit. People drifted toward the fellowship hall for cake and punch. Laughter, the clink of paper plates, the rustle of coats. I stayed seated until the crowd thinned. When the room had emptied to a few lingering greetings and the pastor's jacket still carried the perfume of aftershave, I walked up the aisle. Lovely service, I said, and my voice sounded steadier than I felt. Betty, Pastor Gordon's smile was immediate, rehearsed. Isn't this a marvelous proof of God's provision? I took the receipt from my bag. The paper crinkled between my fingers like dry leaves. Then you should know, I said, and placed it in his hand. For a heartbeat, his face lost its ease. Oh well, the Sanders have been very public lately, he stammered. We often recognize certain gifts for the sake of the church's future. You recognize them, I said. You didn't recognize me. His jaw worked. I heard the faint tick of his watch as if it were a clock in the quiet. Betty, these things are complicated, he began. Complicated? The word came out a whisper, small but sharp. I could feel the pearl brooch in my throat. Its cool weight a tiny, familiar anchor. I wrote the check. I told you not to tell. You promised. He smiled then, but it was a different smile, one that held no apology. He slid the receipt back into his pocket and folded his hands, the epitome of calm authority. We'll handle it, he said. There's always a way. That night I couldn't sleep. The house felt like a stranger's. The roof tapped in the rain, a steady, pinprick rhythm. I took out the check again and smoothed the paper. The numbers didn't look like money anymore. They looked like a ledger of my own foolishness, of misplaced trust. I dialed the bank in the morning, closed an account I'd had at the church's recommendation for years, and felt for a fleeting moment a small lightness, as if removing that line from my life freed up space to breathe. The Sunday after, I sat in a pew at Bethel Baptist across town. No one called my name from memory. No one used my husband's name to coax me. When the pastor invited visitors to stand, I rose. My name is Betty Williams, I said, and my voice didn't shake. I'm looking for a new home. Some things don't need applause to be true. Some debts are paid in silence. The pearl brooch felt warm against my heart as I sat down. And for the first time in months, I let myself listen to the hymn without counting the claps. My hands were still shaking when I unfolded the paper. The stamp said paid in full in red, the numbers handwritten in blue ink that I recognized at once. $52,000. The paper was thin, the creases worn where I'd folded it in the car, and it smelled faintly of coffee, the same bitter roast they serve in the fellowship hall after services. I pressed the receipt against my palm as if it could warm me. My loves, thank you for giving me these few minutes of your day. I'm honest with you. This channel is still finding its feet, and every new subscriber is a breath of life as we reach for our first goal of 1,000. If this story touches you, please click subscribe and tell me in the comments which city you're watching from. I'd really love to know. A few days before that Sunday, before the lilies and the banners and the applause, I remember the light in my kitchen. It came low through the blind, the late winter sun, a thin coin of gold on the linoleum. The kettle hissed. The smell of Richard's coffee still lived in the corner mug on the counter, bitter and familiar, like a voice I could almost hear. The house had its own rhythm, a slow, polite silence that kept trying to be company. I'm 74. I've been in that third pew at First Grace longer than most of the choir. You learn the church by touch. There's a nick in the hymn book holder where my knee always tapped. There's a faint dent in the cushion at my left from winter coats. The wood on the edge of the pew is worn smooth where I used to lean my hand while I sang. Little markers of decades. Little markers of a life wrapped around Sunday mornings, potlucks, and prayer chains. Faith, for me, was never loud. It was the smell of lemon sanitizer on study group nights, the feel of the Bible in my lap, the soft vibration of the organ under my thighs. On Wednesday, the study room smelled of damp coats and rain. The windows were beaded with droplets, and when the bell in the tower tolled 5, it sounded like a distant clock, steady and precise. Pastor Gordon spoke about calling that night. He always spoke about calling. His tie was a little too bright, a blue that reminded me of the banners the church hangs for special occasions. He has a way of looking over a room that makes you think he's aiming to bless you, when often what he's really aiming to do is to persuade. He's been accepted to seminary, he said, and his gaze stopped somewhere near my left shoulder. I felt it like a small hand. He needs help. There was a pause. A stack of hymnals made a soft thud as someone shifted. Esther, with her hat tilted and her cane leaning against her chair, gave me an almost imperceptible nod. There's a language the three of us have, years of side glances, of sharing. Those words are like a key in a lock that opens a room full of memories. Richard's laugh, his way of folding the Sunday paper. How he once said he'd rather give away a coat than buy a new suit. Grief has a sharpness that can also clarify. In the tiny cathedral of my kitchen, I felt a clarity. I could help this young man continue his calling. It felt, in that bright, slanted light, like the right thing. I wrote the check at my table. The paper was thin, and the ink smelled faintly of bank machines and old stamps. I count pennies in my head still, I always did. Half of our nest egg went on that line. $52,000 sounded monstrous as I wrote it. But when I thought of the way the pastor had said calling, when I pictured Timothy's hand around his Bible, I felt like I was handing Richard something he would have nodded at once. Timothy came to my house the next day, 24, earnest, with hands still ink-stained from study. He sat with his cup held like a shield and spoke in quick, reverent bursts. "My parents want me to stay with the family business," he said, eyes down. "They don't understand the call." His words landed like a confession and a plea. He had a worn leather folder with Bible verses pressed into the flap. He reminded me of the young Richard. Same set jaw, same stubborn faith. When I told him I would help, I put my hand on the paper and said, "This is between you, me, and God." He cried softly. He folded his fingers into mine and thanked me with a voice that made my throat tight. He promised to honor what we were doing. He promised to pray for me. I believed him. Back at First Grace, there are small things that sit like witnesses. The brass cross on the altar that catches the light at certain hours. The heavy blue curtain behind the pulpit that sways slightly when the HVAC kicks on. An empty pew in the second row. Mrs. Hall used to sit there before she moved south, and no one has filled it since. Those objects gather, meaning the way moss gathers on stone. The pearl brooch Richard gave me sits in the pocket of my dress, warm and familiar. I touch it when decisions feel heavy. Pastor Gordon called me with updates, tuition numbers, book lists, the little administrative details no one really thinks about until they're trying to make a young man's life possible. His voice was soft and steady. "Your reward will be in heaven, Betty," he'd say, and I would repeat the line like a prayer. He never mentioned the Sanders, or the committee, or the politics of recognition. He never, in those conversations with just me, suggested that public credit might be part of the plan. In the days before the send-off, I walked through the sanctuary in the afternoon when it was empty. The sunlight through the stained glass threw gentle color across the altar. I stood there looking at the brass cross and thought of Richard, how he used to wobble his head when the pastor got too flowery, and I placed my palm against the cold wood of a pew where we'd sit together. The imprint of my hand stayed there, a warm, temporary witness. There are moments that feel small and safe and carry a quiet faith. I kept telling myself that. I kept telling myself I was doing what we were taught, to give, to trust, to support the next generation. But I also felt, in the small hollow behind my breastbone, a caution I couldn't name, a whisper that not every hand offered in blessing was free of calculation. The blue curtain at the back of the chancel folded like a secret. The empty pew waited. I carried the check home, folded in my Bible, a hopeful weight. I slept with the image of Timothy praying, and I woke with the sound of the bell in my head, steady as a heartbeat. The study room smelled of rain and lemon sanitizer, a clean, sharp scent that always settled over our Wednesday nights. The windows were beaded with water, the fluorescent light hummed just a fraction off key, and my coat still clung to the dampness along the collar. Pastor Gordon was in his element, his tie a shade too bright, his voice a practiced warmth that filled the room like a welcome mat. "He's been accepted to seminary," he said, his eyes skimming the circle until they landed somewhere near my left shoulder. He didn't have to point. I felt it like a small hand pressing on my ribs. But he needs help. The words were simple as a hymn, but they landed in me like a stone. My throat closed. I could taste the metal of grief. Funny how it shows up in the mouth. I could hear the radiator ticking. Esther sat 2 chairs down, hat tilted. Kane leaned against the pew, her chin tilted toward me like someone offering a lookout. She doesn't speak much, but her presence reads like comfort. Afterward, in the corridor, the coffee from the fellowship hall hung in the air, bitter and familiar. Pastor Gordon stepped close enough that I could smell his aftershave. He put a hand on my arm. It should have been a gesture of condolence. Instead, it felt like a lever. "Betty," he said, soft as if he were tucking a fragile thing in a drawer, "you always had a generous heart. Richard would have loved this." Everything in me moved then. There's a hollow a widow keeps where memory and loyalty sit together, and his words fell straight into it. I saw Richard as he used to be, smiling, folding the Sunday paper, the way his fingers had knuckled around my hand when church collection plates passed. I remember the night we balanced the accounts, the way he said, "Give it where it'll count." His laugh echoed like a bell. Grief makes the past feel like advice. His hand left my arm, and the corridor felt colder. I stood a little straighter because habit tells you to. My palms were damp. My fingers went numb at the edges. There's a sensation, a little electric tug at the base of the thumb, right before you decide to spend what you've been saving for comfort. I felt it, the old, steady caution that had kept our bills balanced for decades. And then there was the sharper thing, the itch to do something meaningful with my hands when all I had else were memories. That night the house was too quiet. The kettle hissed in the kitchen like a small passing train. The mug Richard always left by the sink still had the ghost of his coffee in it, bitter and faint. I sat at the table with my ledger spread like a map. Sunlight came low through the blinds, thin as a coin. The number I would write breathed at me from the paper like a distance. $52,000. Half of what Richard and I had tucked away over years of Sunday suppers, careful tips, and the odd overtime he'd taken at the shop. It was money meant for shingles if the roof ever failed, meant for a trip to California to see Jennifer more than twice a year, meant to buy someone to sit with me when the evenings stretched long. My hands trembled as I reached for the checkbook. My breath came shallow, like the shallow hymns we used to mumble when the choir was shaky. I thought of Pastor Gordon's eyes when he said calling. I thought of Timothy's earnest face in the study circle, of the way he'd read the scriptures with a kind of hunger I'd not seen in some of the younger faces around us. I thought of Richard's simple creed, do what's right when it matters. I opened the checkbook and paused. The paper under my pen was wider than I expected, the fibers a little toothier than the envelopes I'd used for charity in the past. Ink smells faintly of bank machines and old stamps. My fingers found the pen like muscle memory, decades of filling out contribution envelopes, of signing my name at the back of the church for bake sale donations for charity boxes. The number felt enormous when I wrote it. Each numeral was deliberate, slow, as if etching in a bone. When I signed it, I felt a hollowing out and a fullness at the same time. It was a physical thing. The cool weight of the pen between my fingers, the soft thud of the cap when I set it down, the paper's faint crinkle against the table. My chest tightened. I put both hands flat on the ledger for a moment, feeling my heartbeat at the pads of my palms, steady and human. I folded the check and slid it into my Bible. It felt like a covenant. The next afternoon Timothy came by. He was 24, young enough that the world still seemed like possibility on his face. He kept his hands wrapped around a chipped teacup like it was the most precious thing he owned. He talked nervous and quick, eyes down at first, then looking up with a kind of unabashed hope that hurt me. "My parents, they want me to stay with the family business," he said, the words clumsy and honest. "They don't understand the call." I could smell the pages of his leather folder, old paper and ink, and it tugged at a memory of Richard's workshop, with shavings, engine oil, a radio humming old country songs. I told him quietly, "This is between you, me, and God." I watched him breathe, as if someone had unlatched a window in his chest. He pressed his hands to mine, with a pressure that felt like prayer. Tears gathered then, his and mine, and I let them come. He promised to honor it. He promised to pray for me. I believed him. When he left, I smoothed my hands over the Bible where the check lay folded, the paper warm against the leather. My fingertips remembered the weight of the choice. My chest still had a small, tight knot in it, an ache that said I had done something both right and irreversible. I could not know then how others would name that choice. I only knew the feel of the pen, the smell of coffee, and the echo of Richard's laugh in the empty rooms. The receipt was a photograph in my pocket. Every time I touched the fold of that paper, I saw a frame. The choir at full swell, the Sanders waving like they owned the light. After the service, I waited near the coffee urn like the rest of them. Only I wasn't hungry. People braided around me, pats on the back, quick condolences. I saw Pastor Gordon across the room, his hand smoothing his tie, as if it were an afterthought he could rearrange like a ribbon. He was talking to Mr. Sanders, and the watch on his wrist flashed when he turned. The ticking of that watch made me oddly aware of the seconds slipping by, the same seconds I'd once counted with Richard by my elbow as we balanced the bills. I moved toward Timothy when the crowd thinned. He stood by the coat rack, the leather folder clasped to his chest, as if it were a shield. When he saw me, he gave that earnest smile. Then it faltered, just a fraction, as if the portion of his mind that had learned to read faces for church had missed a page. "Timothy," I said. My voice fell like a thread. "May I speak with you for a moment?" He looked down at his hands and then up, and there was a quick, guilty flush on his cheeks. "Mrs. Williams." Thank you again. I can't believe it." He kept his eyes from mine. It was a small thing, but the way he tucked his chin made a question hang between us. Had Pastor Gordon told him to thank the Sanders? Had he been coached to avoid naming donors? He stammered a few phrases, biblical and polite, and the smell of spilled punch and cheap perfume made the room tilt. "You thanked the Sanders," I said, and it wasn't a question. He swallowed. The folder scraped the side of his leg. "They did step forward at the last minute. They helped with some of the fees." He stopped. His hands fluttered. "I'm grateful for everyone who helped," he finished, and the words landed like feathers. There was softness in him. I wanted to believe he'd been put in an impossible spot by a man he trusted. Instead, I found myself holding the receipt in my bag like a small, burning coal. "Did Pastor Gordon tell you not to mention donors by name?" I asked. Timothy's shoulders dipped. He blinked as if trying to clear rain from a window. "He advised me to express gratitude to the congregation," he said slowly. "He said some families prefer to give publicly." That was answer enough. I let a silence fill the space. Esther was nearby, her hat slightly askew from where she'd been greeting people, and she caught my eye with the same steady look she'd given me at study group for years. She did not need words. Later, I found Pastor Gordon in the small office behind the sanctuary where hymnals leaned like stacked ships. He greeted me with that practiced warmth that didn't reach the eyes. Up close, his smile was a hinge that moved easily into charm or dismissal, depending on what the moment required. "Betty," he said, and his voice had the careful tilt he uses when he wants a congregation to feel held. "Aren't you pleased?" The church rallied. "I'm pleased Timothy will go," I said. I kept my hands folded so they would not tremble. The pearl at my lapel felt larger than a piece of jewelry. It was a compass point I pressed when I needed steadiness. "I'm not pleased to be erased." His jaw worked for a heartbeat. He clasped his hands in front of him, the Bible on his desk like a small island. "We had certain considerations," he said. The words were soft, diplomatic. "Acknowledging prominent donors, it's part of stewardship. It encourages others." Stewardship. I repeated. My voice was quiet, but it cut. I gave out of grief and faith. "You asked me to keep it between us." He glanced away as if the rafters might hold the answer. The watch on his wrist clicked, a minute passing like a verdict. "Betty, these decisions are not personal." He folded his hands as if folding a map. "We manage the church's needs as a whole." "You managed to mention the Sanders by name," I said. The pearl brooch warmed under my fingers. "You managed to offer a press-friendly line. You managed my trust like it was an entry in a budget." He sighed, a small, practiced sound like someone clearing a throat. "We must look at the bigger picture." The bigger picture? The phrase tasted hollow. I felt the years of pews and casseroles, the time I'd washed dishes after dinners, the potlucks where I'd trimmed brownies and smiled at the right moments. All of it felt distilled into that one word. Outside the office window, a delivery truck backed up with the thump of a loading ramp. The ordinary noises of the church world continued. Chairs scraping, a child laughing down the hallway, while my small private ledger of hurt grew a little heavier in my palm. When I left, Esther took my elbow. The cane tapped a slow Morse against the floor. "You did the right thing," she said, and her voice was a warm blanket. Her eyes knowingly followed Pastor Gordon through the glass. People like to be seen. She pursed her lips in a way that said she knew how often being seen mattered more than being true. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with the receipt again. The radio in the corner murmured the news, weather, a headline about some distant city, and everything felt absurdly small. I pictured Richard's hands, calloused and sure, folded over mine in the dark. He would have said the right thing. He would have seen the line between charity and performance. I made the calls the next morning. The bank teller's voice was polite. The bureaucratic language of account transfers felt like a neutral ritual. When the account was closed and the line on my statements rearranged, a thin lightness rose in me. It wasn't joy. It was a small, clean relief, like opening a window after winter. The decision to go to Bethel Baptist didn't come like thunder. It came like a slow understanding, a series of small steps. Sitting in a different sanctuary, surrounded by faces that didn't know my history, I felt the oddest thing. I could breathe without performing gratitude. I could listen to hymns without counting claps. Some photographs fade. Some stay. The receipt will be one I will hold in memory like a record, sharp at the edges. But alongside it, there will be others. The way Esther squeezed my hand in the pew, Timothy's voice breaking when he thanked everyone without naming me, the cold of Pastor Gordon's smile. They are frames of a season I have lived through. And in the quiet between them, I am learning that faith is sometimes a private thing you carry like a warm stone in your pocket, warmed by your own hand. The days after the service felt like someone had quietly rearranged the town and left me out of the map. It started small, a smile that didn't reach the eyes, a handshake that broke before fingers met. Then the space between people widened until it was a room of its own. Sunday mornings used to be a stream of familiar faces. Mrs. Hall's bobbed hair, the Martins with their matching ties, kids chasing hymnals. Now people moved around me as if I were a piece of furniture that might topple if touched. At the coat rack where I once chatted about casseroles, a woman turned and tucked her purse of hair closer to her chest when I approached. Her whisper stopped when I looked up, and I saw the color drain from her cheeks. She smiled, the practiced church smile, then crossed to the other side, as if crossing the aisle could erase whatever she thought had happened. At the grocery store, the teller scanned my bread slower than usual, eyes flicking to the name on the loyalty card and back to me. "How are you, Mrs. Williams?" she asked without inflection. Her voice sounded distant, like a radio playing in another room. When I answered, she gave that small, hollow nod and slid my change across the counter like it was the least interesting part of her job. Later, in the parking lot, a neighbor I'd known for 20 years pretended not to see me, turning his head and pretending to examine the clouds. I called his name. He didn't turn. Whispers started in the pews. I could feel them like drafts. A cluster of women who used to meet for the quilting circle now sat with fabrics folded tight, eyes down, fingers moving deliberately to avoid conversation. "Did you hear about the send-off?" Someone murmured once, loud enough for the back row to catch it. "So generous. The Sanders, such a public donation." The implication was a soft razor. I sat very still, the pearl brooch cool against my chest, and listened to the edges of sentences that never mentioned my name. The church bulletin table used to be a small marketplace of community. Flyers for the food pantry, sign-up sheets for the soup kitchen, invitations to card night. One week a sign-up sheet for Thanksgiving dishes appeared with spaces filled by familiar names and one column conspicuously blank where my name had once been. I asked Esther if she had noticed. She patted my hand, her knuckles firm and warm. "They're scared," she said. "People like to be seen." She didn't say who they were scared of. She didn't have to. Phone calls grew fewer. Jennifer called, as she always did on Thursdays, but her voicemail boxes filled sooner and her messages shrank to 10 seconds. "Love you, Mom. Busy, call soon." I would leave a longer message and listen to the little tone clicking before the line cut. Once a polite woman from the church office called to ask if I could bring a tray to a luncheon. I could hear the hesitation, like someone stepping back from a threshold. "Oh no, Betty, that won't be necessary," she said. The sentence trailed. No explanation. No invitation. I stopped receiving the little comforts that mark a caring community. No casseroles at the door. No notes slipped under the screen. No offers to pick up prescriptions when the weather turned sour. The mail came steady and ordinary, but envelopes that once carried friendly invitations were thin with silence. There were still the necessary calls, my name on the bank statement, the mail carrier's usual greeting, small, impersonal threads that held the practical world together while everything else unspooled. When I did see people, their faces were choreographed to avoid leaving impressions. Mr. Sanders gave me a nod that was more business than greeting, like a man tipping his hat to a familiar brand. Pastor Gordon's eyes skimmed past me now, a practiced avoidance. Once, when our gazes met, he offered a few words about stewardship and community, and his smile fit neatly into the role he'd always played. The words sounded rehearsed. In his hand, the Bible looked like a prop. Timothy's politeness was the most painful. He still served at the door some Sundays, his folder tucked under his arm, but his gratitude was general, thanks to everyone, and he never caught my eye. Once he passed me on the stairs, and his fingers brushed my arm by accident. He stopped, apologized, then walked on as if nothing had happened. His apology felt like a closed door. Maybe he'd been coached. Maybe he'd been told what to say to keep favor. The fact that he did not look at me felt like a small, deliberate erasure. Rumors thickened in the margins. People began to ask one another what had really happened behind the scenes. It was complicated, someone said in a voice meant to sound forgiving. There were considerations. I heard the words the way you hear a country road wind, meaning there was no single straight answer, only a plan that suited those who mattered most. The isolation built like a slow weather pattern. At potlucks, fewer plates bore my name. Invitations to card nights stopped coming. An elderly couple who used to stop by for Sunday coffee began bringing up errands with, "Oh, we're already heading the other way." It is a specific kind of loneliness when the places that once felt like shelter start to close like shutters against a storm. Esther held my hand more often. She sat next to me in church when she could, her cane tapping a steady rhythm. She was a lighthouse in foggy weather. But even her loyal presence couldn't change the way eyes slid away or how conversation stalled when I sat down. I learned, in those long afternoons, the small mathematics of exclusion, how 100 tiny omissions add up to an enormous absence. Still, when I walked past the hollowed spot in the third pew, I rubbed the pearl brooch between my fingers and feel its coolness like a truth. The world outside those pews may rearrange itself, but there are decisions I have already made. The door that closed behind me was loud enough that the neighbors heard it. The one I might open next will have to be on my own terms, and that thought steadies me, even as the town whispers. The organ swells, and I feel in my bones, deep, steady like someone knocking on the underside of a wooden table. Pastor Gordon's voice rises over it, warm and practiced, the syllables vibrating through the sanctuary. His words make the glass tremble. Light from the stained windows paints his collar in blues and golds. And for a second the pulpit looks like an altar in a picture book. My hands are folded in my lap. I have folded them this way for decades. Thumbs crossed, fingers laced so tightly the knuckles blanch. I press my palms together until the skin hums. Breathe in, breathe out. I tell myself I can hold it together. I tell myself that silence is prayer. The smell of polished wood curls up from the pulpit, wax and old hymnals, and something in that familiar scent turns sharp, like lemon cleaner left on the counter too long. The choir holds a long note, and the rafters answer it. The sound bounces, and with every echo, I feel the shape of the room pressing in around me. People are leaning forward, rows of heads like a slow-moving tide. And we thank our faithful supporters, Pastor Gordon says, and his gaze finds the Sanders as if he had been trained to aim it there. The name cuts through the air like a bell. In the pocket of my dress, my fingers close over the paper I've folded into a small, hot square. The receipt. The red stamp says paid in full. $52,000 scrawled in familiar handwriting that feels like a betrayal. A hush falls right after his words, the kind of quiet that follows a big note in the choir. Then the applause comes, slow at first, then rising until the whole room seems to clap at once. The sound thuds against my chest. Every clap lands on that paper in my bag like an accusation. A candle on the altar sputters, as if someone has breathed near it. For a second, the flame flutters, then dies. I watch it go out, and something in me goes with it. A tiny warm expectation, snuffed, smoke curling like a small dark question. The draft is so slight, I almost think I imagined it. But the wax leaves a tiny black smudge on the brass holder, sooty and real. Timothy stands beside the pastor, the microphone close to his face. He looks smaller when he speaks, less like a young man on the verge of the future and more like someone squeezed into a role he didn't choose. He thanks the Sanders. His voice is steady, polite, trained to gratitude. He never looks toward the third pew. My breath has gotten shallow. I count the seconds between inhales as if I'm keeping time on a clock that will tell me when I will break. I slide my thumb to the brooch in my throat. Its cool pearl is my anchor. I can feel the tremor in my fingers, the old, familiar map of veins and age spots. Esther squeezes my hand once. Her grip is a small, bright thing in the dim. The pulpit smells of lemon polish and the faint cologne that hangs around Pastor Gordon like a cloud. His smile is smooth as varnish. He lifts his hand as if to bless the room, and the motion is so practiced it becomes a performance. Such generosity, he says, and the word hangs like a mirror held up so the whole congregation can see their reflection. At that exact moment, the little crucifix that leans at the edge of the pulpit, always there, a quiet witness, tilts. I think it was the tremor from the applause, or maybe the HVAC kicking on, or an old nail finally giving way. It slips and falls with a soft thud onto the wooden floor. The sound is not loud in the way a crash would be, but it is intimate and impossible to ignore. Heads turn just for a beat. Someone coughs. The thud is a punctuation mark. It feels like all the small things line up at once to mark it. The candle went out. The crucifix fell. Pastor Gordon's voice keeps moving as if none of it matters. It is like watching a clock keep time while the house burns behind it. My hands start to shake more. I fold the paper tighter until the creases eat into the center of the receipt. My legs are wobbly, but I stand. The pews creak under me. The sound so loud in my ears it might as well be thunder. People turn when I rise, curiosity and that particular discomfort of a crowd watching something awkward unfold. I walk the aisle as if walking through a dream I've known my whole life. The soles of my shoes whisper against the hardwood. The smell of lemon cleaner and old coffee follows me like a memory I'm trying to outrun. Pastor Gordon looks at me when I reach the front, and his smile slips just a fraction. He has that practiced ease for everyone, but not for the one who carries the truth into the light. Lovely service, I say. My voice is steadier than my hands. I press the receipt into his palm. The paper feels heavier here at the pulpit than it did in my bag. He glances down at it, then up at me, and for a blink his face loses the mask of pastoral composure. The pause stretches like taffy. Oh well, the Sanders, he begins, and his words are a net meant to catch the moment and reshape it. You thank them, I say. You thank them for what I did. He looks at me the way a man looks at a ledger that has a line he didn't expect. There's a brief, private shifting behind his eyes, calculation, apology, and something sharp that could be a decision. Behind him the congregation rustles, a room that holds its breath. The crucifix lies on the floor between us, a quiet little exile. Wax from the candle has left a dark smear on the altar rail. The room smells of old wood and burnt wick and the tiny electric ozone that comes off a crowd holding too many secrets. I steady my hands on the edge of the pulpit and feel the grain of the wood under my fingertips. It is the same wood I have touched for 40 years. It does not move. For a moment, all the practiced phrases Pastor Gordon might use hang like fruit on a branch. He chooses one, the one that keeps the picture tidy for everyone else. We have to be careful how we recognize gifts, he says, voice soft as satin. Some donors prefer public acknowledgement. It's about stewardship. The sentence is neat. It is also a dismissal. I pull my hand back slowly. The receipt remains between us like a small, stubborn truth. In the hush that follows, I can hear my own breathing, quick, shallow, the sound of something in me lifts and settles at once. The room is the same, but rearranged. The pastor's voice continues to vibrate through the rafters, but for the first time in a long time, I hear the words and the intention behind them as separate things. I sit down slowly. My hands are empty now. The receipt is not a comfort, and the pearl in my throat feels like a small, bright accusation against the dark. Outside, a door creaks and sighs on an old hinge, the sound like a small invitation. I breathe in. I breathe out. Then goes on, and so do I. The knock at my door came on a Tuesday afternoon, when the light through the blinds was thin and the house felt the way it did the day I wrote that check. Waiting, almost patient. I wasn't expecting anyone. I had folded the receipt into the Bible again and put the book on the table like a small, guarded thing. When I opened the door, there he was, Timothy. He looked older than when I'd last seen him at the send-off, but still 24 in the ways that mattered. The quick, hopeful tilt of his head, the nervousness in his hands. He had a leather folder under his arm and the faint smell of library ink about him. "Mrs. Williams," he said. His voice was steady but thin, like a hymn sung too softly. He kept his eyes down, then lifted them as if asking for permission to stay. "Come in," I said. The house hummed with the old pipes and a radio from the neighbor. I made tea because it felt like the right thing to do. The kettle hissed in that familiar way, and the cup warmed his fingers when I handed it over. He sat across from me and opened the folder like someone unfolding a prayer. He stopped. He looked at his hands as if learning what to do with them. "I should have come sooner. I wanted to tell you thank you." Properly. The words were small, but they landed clean. I set my hand on the pearl brooch at my chest without thinking. It steadied me. "You thank the Sanders," I said. The last time I'd spoken to him, his eyes had avoided mine. The memory of that public thanks still felt like a bruise. His mouth tightened. "Yes." He exhaled, long and slow. "Pastor Gordon told me to thank them. He said it would be better, that they'd been public about helping and the congregation needed a face to see." I thought he was right then. I thought I should keep my mouth small. He dug in the folder and drew out a copy of his seminary receipt. The ink was navy and official-looking. It matched the thin paper I'd carried in my purse for weeks. "I kept this," he said. "I found it the first week of classes." I read it, and my stomach dropped. I should have spoken then, but I was afraid. I thought, if I contradicted the pastor, I'd lose more than a voice. I'd lose everything. He looked at me then, properly looked, and I saw the sincere shame folding his young face into itself. "Your check paid it, Mrs. Williams." I don't know how they talked about it later. I was told to say different things. "I'm sorry he didn't look at you when I spoke that day." I was ashamed of how small and clever men had made something sacred. Tears came then, quiet and wet. Not the theatrical kind. Not the kind that asked for attention. They were honest, the kind that belongs to people who have been given a gift and fear they don't deserve it. I touched my brooch and felt the pearl's coolness under my fingers. "You promised to honor it," he said, voice trembling. "I promised. And I have. Not the way the church announced it. Loud and neat, but I have used every dollar where it needed to be. Tuition, books, rent. I carried your gift like a map. When I was ordained in May, I dedicated the day to quiet givers, people who give and never look for cameras. I read a line I wrote myself. I said your name in my heart." He reached in a folder again and handed me a small program. On the inside, in a careful script, he had written a line from his ordination sermon. At the bottom, in a place no one in the sanctuary had seen, he had printed a single sentence. "In gratitude to Betty Williams, whose quiet faith made this calling possible." I looked at the paper until the words blurred. The room shrank to the distance between his earnest face and my own worn hands. It wasn't a public accolade. It was smaller, simpler, an acknowledgement private and true. "You were coached," I said. It was not an accusation. It was a fact that finally had a name. He nodded. "I was. And I didn't fight hard enough. I should have. I am sorry." Forgiveness arrived, not like a bell, but like a slow hand on the shoulder. I thought of Richard, how he would have set his cup down and said, "Do what's right," and then fixed the problem with slow practicality. I felt his steady presence as if he were in the next room, whistling off-key at the radio. "I wanted to be invisible," I said. "I asked that it be between me, you, and God. Pastor Gordon promised me that." My voice cracked on the last word, and then steadied. You didn't have to thank me in front of everyone. You could have said nothing. Timothy reached across the table and took my hand. His palm was warm and callous from working, studying, serving, learning to build a life that wasn't all words. I wanted to come and tell you myself, he said. To show you this, he tapped the program. And to say that I will not let it be forgotten. There is no unmaking the erasing that had been done. No public apology from the pulpit. No headline that changed the town. But there was truth offered and received. That evening, when he left, he pressed a small carved cross into my hand, a thing he made in a woodshop class, rough and beautiful and heavy with intention. After the door closed, I sat at the sink with the wooden cross in my palm and the receipt folded in the Bible on the table. The two things sat beside each other, one the record of a sacrifice, the other small proof that it had not been wasted. Days later, I found myself walking back to Bethel with a tin of cookies tucked under my arm. I volunteered in their food pantry. I signed up to help with the Wednesday study group. Faith, I learned, is not a line item on a ledger. It's a muscle you work in the small things, showing up, handing over bread, answering truth for truth. The weight in my chest was not gone. It was rebalanced. I had been seen, finally, by the one whose future I paid for. That, more than applause, settled something inside me. The world could keep its ceremonies and its public thanks. I would keep my quiet, and I would let my giving be both a memory and a thing that changed someone's life. Sometimes dignity comes back in pieces. It will not erase the watchful eyes at first grace or the way people rearrange themselves after that Sunday. But Timothy's visit gave me a miracle I did not expect. Not vindication, but acknowledgement. A private truth that let me fold the receipt one last time and set on the shelf, next to the Bible, where it could be part of the story. Not the ending of it, but a chapter one could live with. I went back once more. Not to make a scene, not to reclaim a name. I wanted to lay something down. The day was thin with winter light, the sun a pale, coins sliding across the parking lot. I parked where I always had, by the maple that throws a crooked shadow in July. The church doors smelled the same, lemon polish and old coffee, and that small familiarity felt like a hand I could still take. Inside, the sanctuary was quiet. The blue banners hung limp, the brass cross on the altar catching a sliver of light. Dust motes moved like little pilgrims across the air. My shoes whispered against the floorboards. The pew where Richard and I had sat for 40 years was empty in the way memory can be empty, full of imprints but not of bodies. I had the carved cross Timothy made, still warm in my pocket from the day. He pressed it into my hand. I had the receipt folded into my Bible at home, a record that felt less like a wound now and more like a map. I slid my fingers beneath the pew and felt the familiar nick in the wood where my knee used to tap. The dent in the cushion was there, soft and patient. I rested the cross on the seat where we used to tuck our coats and fold hymnals. No one watched. No quiet with. The quiet let me hear the building breathe, the HVAC sighing in the back, a distant muffled radio through the office, a truck backing up outside with a hollow thump. I placed my palm lightly over the cross. Its grain was rough and honest under my skin. It smelled faintly of sawdust and something of Timothy, library ink, late-night study, the clean dust of a workshop. I thought of the day the little crucifix fell from the pulpit, how the sound landed the way truth does sometimes, small and unavoidable. I thought of the candle that went out, of the applause that had felt like cold water, of the way Pastor Gordon's smile had curved away from me like a closed door. I thought of Esther's hand in mine, steady and sure. I thought of Richard, and how his laugh used to fill corners of rooms. Then I stood. I did not make a speech. Ceremonies have their place, but this was not one of them. I smoothed my skirt and left the carved cross where my coat would have been. I left it as a small witness, an honest thing for the wood to remember. The steps on the aisle creaked under my weight, and for a moment I thought the whole building might remember me by sound. The door at the back waited like an unhurried friend. I turned once, just once, and looked down the length of the sanctuary. Light pooled on the hymnals. The brass glinted. The altar stood as if expecting me to come back. Then I walked away. My footsteps on the steps sounded like someone closing chapter. They were soft at first, and then a little lighter, as if someone had set down an old, heavy coat. I could hear the echo, wood on wood, the faint drag of my heels, the whisper of the hem of my dress. Behind me, the building kept its breath. Ahead of me, the winter air hit my face, cold and certain. A gust folded itself into the doorway, just as I reached it. It was small, only a nudge of wind, and yet it felt enormous. The heavy door swung slow and true, and then closed with the soft click of an old hinge. The sound was gentle, final. It was like the last page of a book settling into place. Outside, the sky had a narrow thread of blue. I put my hand on the carved cross in my pocket, the wood warm from my skin, and I breathed in. The town hummed at a distance. Cars, a dog barking, someone mowing a yard that smelled faintly of gasoline and pine clippings. Life, ordinary and relentless, went on. I walked toward my car with my shoulders a little straighter than when I'd come. There was no triumph in it. No parade. Just the steady knowledge that I had laid something down where it could be part of the story instead of being its end. The sanctuary behind me held its own truths, some bright, some shadowed. I left it with the carved cross, with the imprint of my hand on an old pew, and with the memory of a receipt folded into a Bible on my shelf. The sound of my heels grew softer as I moved away. The final click of the door, that small, clean closing, hung behind me for a breath, then softened into the day. A wind skated along the street and lifted the hem of my skirt for a second, like a small benediction. I turned my face to it and let it cool the places grief had warmed. When I reached the car, I did not look back a second time. Some doors are meant to be left closed. Some pews are meant to hold impressions and nothing more. I drove home slowly, the road familiar, the radio murmuring in the background. At my kitchen table, the Bible waited, and the carved cross sat on the mantel where light would find it in the morning. That night, I slept without turning the pages of the receipt in my head. I slept with my hand on the pearl brooch tucked into the nightstand drawer and with the sense that a weight had shifted, not taken away, but rearranged so I could carry it without bending. There are endings that are loud and public. There are others that are quiet, like a door closing in the wind. Mine closed with a small, certain click, and then opened to an ordinary new beginning. I still wake some mornings to the sound of the church bell. Like a distant heartbeat, I once followed without question. Sometimes it takes me a full minute to remember which sanctuary it belonged to. The sound is the same, deep, steady, but the direction of my life has shifted a little, like the way a sunbeam crosses the kitchen table afternoon. I keep my Bible on the nightstand now, the receipt folded inside where it can't be seen unless I mean for it to be. The carved cross Timothy gave me sits on the mantel. Its grain is worn smooth where my thumb has passed over it more than once. I sleep easier. The town keeps its rhythms. Pastor Gordon still speaks with the polished cadence I used to trust. The Sanders still smile in the front row and count the space they occupy as though it were territory. People still organize potlucks and choir practices. But the center of my life has moved off the long center aisle and into small rooms where hands are busy and words are true. Bethel Baptist became more than a place where I waited for the organ to swell. I started volunteering in the pantry, carrying boxes that smelled of canned tomatoes and dust and the small hope of stretching a meal. I signed up for the Wednesday study group, not because I wanted a crowd to watch how brave I was, but because I wanted to see faces that were not counting my worth in applause. There's a peculiar comfort in being one among many, nameless in the back row, learning to listen again without measuring every look. Timothy's visit changed the shape of the loss in my chest. It didn't undo the Sunday the pulpit tilted toward the Sanders, or the way the crucifix had fallen like a punctuation mark under the pastor's voice. It didn't make the town recoil any less in the weeks after. But when he sat at my kitchen table and opened that folder, the room felt right-sized for truth. He showed me the program he'd tucked into his ordination, the private line that named me, not for spectacle, but for conscience. I cannot pretend the private acknowledgement is the same as standing under the chandeliers. But it was honest. It was his, and it was ours. I learned slowly that generosity is a complicated muscle. You can exercise it for praise, and you can exercise it in secrecy. Both can change a life, but only one keeps your dignity intact. Giving from grief is not a sin. It is a confession of faith. But so is refusing to become an instrument for someone else's reputation. There are seasons when faith asks us to give loudly, and seasons when it asks us to tuck things into the Bible and trust the pages to hold them. Esther held my hand through the cold months. Her cane tapped a patient rhythm beside me, and her hat was crooked in the way only friends can tolerate. She watched the congregation shift away, and she did not flinch. "People like to be seen," she said one afternoon, pouring tea into 2 chipped cups. "They forget sometimes that being seen is not the same as being known." I have kept that line with me. I have learned to measure being known against being visible. Jennifer called more often after I left First Grace. Her voice was hurried at first, work and appointments and the West Coast schedule, but something in the distance changed. She asked more questions about my days. She wanted to hear me sing the hymns I used to hum under my breath. The roof over our bedroom still leaks a little where time has thinned the shingles. I haven't fixed it yet. There are practical things the money would have solved. But there are other repairs that needed doing first. Repair to my sense of who I am beyond the pew. The slow sanding of a dignity roughened by erasure. I still visit the old sanctuary from time to time. Not to reclaim a title. Not to demand apologies. I go to lay the carved cross or to sit in the third pew with my hand on the dented wood and remember. Memory is a landscape that keeps both sunlight and shadow. I put a small thing in the place where my coat used to lie, and I let the building hold it for a while. It is a private gesture, the sort that makes no noise in the bulletin. I prefer it that way. Forgiveness settled into me gradually, not as a neat ribbon tied around an old hurt, but as a pragmatic warmness that lets me move without being weighed down. I forgave Pastor Gordon in the way people forgive because they are tired of carrying a stone. They place it on a shelf, not because it doesn't matter, but because they need both hands free. Timothy's life is unfolding as it should. He writes occasionally practical lines about seminary and sermons, and a small, careful acknowledgement that he keeps to himself when he prays. That is more important than any headline. Sometimes, late in the evening, I take the receipt from the Bible and smooth the creases with my thumb. The ink has the slight fade of something that has been looked at often and loved anyway. I remember the way the paper felt heavy the day I wrote the check, and I remember the day I pressed it into the pastor's hand. Both are true. Both live in the same room in my mind. It turns out faith is less a public display than a private endurance. It is the way you stand back up after being pushed. It is deciding where to lay your sacrifices so they heal rather than hollow. The world will always have people who prefer the limelight. I have learned to treasure the people who do good without the camera. Esther with her hat, Timothy with his carved cross, strangers at the pantry who do not ask to be thanked. So I keep my Bible near the nightstand, the carved cross on the mantle, the pearl brooch in my jewelry box. I volunteer. I call Jennifer back when she leaves a short message. I listen to hymns without counting claps. The town keeps its ceremonies, and I keep my quiet. Some secrets live to warm you. I carry mine like a small stone in my pocket.
If you've made it this far, thank you from the bottom of my heart for staying until the end. If you feel it in your heart, please subscribe so you won't miss the next stories, and keep walking with me by watching the other videos I've prepared with care. And please, share in the comments what you thought of my testimony. I will read every word.